This is the third part of the discussion on Louis Massignon. There are two preceding videos, and I hope you have watched them before engaging with this one. I am not entirely sure how in depth I have gone in discussing Massignon and his life, and I acknowledge that I have not elaborated extensively on both Hallaj and Massignon. However, for understanding the topic of Orientalism and Edward Said's ideas, this discussion provides a fairly good introduction. Orientalism, particularly French Orientalism, was shaped by a long-standing fascination with the Orient and France's increasing assertion of power and influence in the Arab world. As Ottoman control weakened, this fascination was deeply romanticized and influenced by a century-long engagement with the region. With the development of the scientific method in European Orientalism, largely attributed to Goldziher, scholars sought to illuminate medieval Muslim scholars and transmitters of tradition. This imitation extended to the establishment of their own isnad, or chains of authority, through connections with Goldziher and other European scholars. Interest in the East emerged from various perspectives, as Edward Said discusses in his work. The exploration of Oriental traditions have deeply historical roots. In many ways, the tradition of ancient civilizations led beyond the imagined boundaries of the Western world. Romanticism in various forms has always been a significant factor in the movements of Orientalists. Some pursued this universal and the unfamiliar, while others sought to immerse themselves in a different time and civilization. Due to a sense of estrangement from their own, many sought to rediscover a lost, purer faith through a culture they perceived as more spiritual, despite never truly understanding their own tradition. Others aimed to go native and embrace unfamiliar tastes, sounds, sights, and traditions. Some sought to return to the historical sources of knowledge and tradition. Meanwhile, missionaries and more recently technocratic developers took a different yet equally romanticized approach, seeking to alter, improve, pacify, reform, and control what they perceived as a backward and undeveloped Orient. The way Edward Said wrote about Louis Massignon, rightly after discussing Karl Becker for the first time in his work, gives the reader a sense that Massignon was also following the same line of thought as Becker. For Becker, Islam and Islamic intellectualism were a failed attempt to employ Greek philosophy without creative inspiration, which he later says is found in Renaissance Europe. This idea, as mentioned by Said, has some truth in it, or as we find in Goldziher himself, who claims that the roots of Islamic tradition are greatly embedded in the Jewish-Christian traditions that the Prophet of Islam found around him, and later became the Prophet in a delusion that God reveals such things to him. Now, talking about Massignon, Said writes that for him, Hallaj was the figure much more revered than Averroes and the Prophet himself, who was the real hero of Islamic spirituality. For him, Hallaj was like a Christ figure who elevates beyond what anyone possibly can in the Islamic tradition. Mentioning the 5 Oriental scholars in the later pages, Said discusses how even the praise for Islam had fallen into ruins when these scholars, including Massignon, Goldziher, MacDonald, Becker, and Hurgaranji, simultaneously followed their own ventures into Islam and represented it in a way that aligned with their own perspectives rather than its true essence. While it is true that all these mentioned names were highly involved in politics, Said also mentions the depth of Massignon in his scholarship on Islam, also including Gibb. Gibb's acknowledgement of Massignon's works, sometimes favoring Massignon's and sometimes criticizing him, was discussed by Said as well, and can give us a picture of how Massignon's devotion goes beyond the objective study of Islam. Werdenberg elaborates on this idea further, with Said also including that Massignon's real intention was to understand the nature of love for God that he felt for Hallaj. Werdenberg elaborates on this idea further, with Said also including that Massignon's real intention was to understand the nature of love for God that he felt in Hallaj. The Orthodox community survives in a kind of ontological thirst. God presents himself to man as a kind of absence, a refusal to be present. This concept, from an orthodox perspective, does not give the person the understanding of God, but rather a figure to worship that the Orthodox community sends as God, but in reality is the creation of their minds, a kind of idol present not physically but in their minds. Now, Massignon's own definition of his work, which we also find discussed by Said, is that his Orientalism is different from the rest in the sense that it is not an obsession with the exoticism or the rejection of Europe, but a way to balance our research methods with the tradition of ancient civilization. Now, Said interpreted this as the West, according to Massignon, being modern and the Orient being ancient. While such an interpretation is allowed to some extent, the way Massignon himself understood this was not in terms of modern being something superior or ancient being something old and disregarded. If that were the case, then he might not have chosen Hallaj to be on the top pedestal of human understanding, someone who himself was from the East and gained his realization of the true nature of God within the Eastern culture. Massignon was highly against the Zionist occupation of Palestine and also supported the fact that Palestinians are the people who have every right to own their land. He mentioned Zionism as bourgeois colonialism. Said offers his interpretation that this happened to Massignon because the British dominance in the decision was problematic for him as a Frenchman. Now, I am not sure what his intentions were behind speaking against the occupation. Reading him on this topic does not disclose the intention that Said interprets of him on this. Said later informs the reader that his work itself is subject to a tradition, a kind of structure that no one can escape. As Said later writes, his whole point about this system is not that it is a misrepresentation of some Oriental essence, in which he does not for a moment believe, but that it operates, representations usually do, for a purpose according to a tendency in a specific historical, intellectual, and even economic setting. In other words, representations have a purpose. They are effective much of the time, and they accompany one or many tasks. Said further writes that representations are formations, or as Ronald Barthes has said, of all the operations of language, they are deformations. Now it is up to us to follow the postmodernist way of looking at things, which is not very useful if we are talking about Massignon, who is mostly concerned with knowing what there is to be known from more than an objective dimension, something that is personal to a man and can be meaningless if taught to others as an object. Another significant claim that Said makes regarding Massignon, including Gibb, is that their friendship with Muslims were useful rather than determining. While Gibb and Massignon had very different approaches to Islam, both were highly influenced by central key figures. However, the nature of their friendships remain unclear. Massignon, in particular, found in Islam, especially in Hallaj, a sense of freedom and love for God that deeply attracted him to some of the teachings of Sufism. In my reading of his work on Islam, it is difficult to determine which approach has solid credentials to be considered true. However, for Massignon, Hallaj was a figure who dared to believe that God could be understood and that this understanding was deeply personal. The idea of the divine that most of us hold does not make sense until we recognize its uniqueness in relation to other ideas we have. Otherwise, it becomes merely a symbol that Muslims venerate in worship. This was not the case with Hallaj. Said claims that Massignon revered Hallaj more than Averroes or even the Prophet himself can be debated. Interestingly, Massignon's focus on Hallaj was not arbitrary. There was a reason behind this choice. As I discussed in the previous video, the authenticity of the historical chain of events surrounding Hallaj is strong and can serve as a valuable source for understanding what truly transpired during his time. Massignon, who dedicated a large portion of his work to Hallaj, was often criticized for spending so much time on a figure who was not of significant importance to the majority of Muslims. However, this claim lacks historical basis. Earlier scribes and scholars devoted considerable efforts to gather information about Hallaj. For instance, in the history of Baghdad by Al-Khatib, Hallaj is included among 7,831 biographical notes, ranking third in size after Abu Hanifa and Bukhari. This is particularly interesting because the work compiles the biographies of hadith scholars or muhaddithuns from Baghdad, yet Hallaj was transmitting no hadith, is mentioned prominently. For Khatib as well as for Al-Muslima, Hallaj was recognized as a Sunni Muslim and considered among the important figures in history, an image they sought to present to their readers as well. Said's exploration of Massignon, where he simultaneously discussed Gibb and Massignon, highlights that both scholars were difficult to disregard completely. Said acknowledges this vastness of Massignon's writings and is impressed by how his interdisciplinary scholarship has produced groundbreaking work on Hallaj, Muslim history, and much of Sufi literature. However, such achievements never elevate Massignon beyond being an Orientalist who in some ways contributed to a distorted image of the East. My reading of Massignon and his works present a very different picture from Said. While interpretations of a work may vary, I want to focus on the idea of how we perceive one's writings. Especially regarding Said, I want to highlight that he seems to hold a preconceived belief before engaging with Massignon's work. Now we can say that when we read a person and think we know their beliefs and how they think about certain things, our own mind starts to find a direction in which it tells us that this certain direction is proper when reading a certain text. For example, if a person is reading a Christian who wrote about Islam, then for the reader there will always be a kind of skepticism when the reading is done. The primary question that remains is what faculty of human understanding makes this direction obvious to the person, and how can it be possible for a person to extend their comprehension to understand the other person in a way that includes the other person's own personality. And if this is possible, then the writer, who is obviously taking his thoughts from many directions, puts a limit in his own writing for the reader to not know what has been written in the same way as he understood it when he was writing. This is why Socrates, in one of the dialogues, perhaps I think the Republic, points out that the reader of Homer's works knows more than Homer himself, as the obvious condition we apply to our reading includes variations in interpretation that is even foreign to the author himself. This point, even for me, is quite challenging and leads me to say that all these endeavors in interpreting works are not beneficial, as they involve elements of our own imagination. That is why this struggle for the right interpretation will ultimately culminate in the absence of a reasonable idea. However, one thing we can certainly say about Massignon is that his work is probably one of the best historical analysis of Hallaj, a figure who fascinated him until the end of his life. In the end, I want to say that Said has raised some very important points, but what is more important is to understand why Massignon wrote certain things and what concerned him in writing such things. Said analysis takes a very different approach, one that I could not find in Massignon or regarding him. Rather, I can say one thing: Massignon was no less than a scholar, and it might be possible to see him as a highly obsessed with the Christ-like figure that he saw in Hallaj. However, some points regarding Hallaj and his life that he gathered in his writings are very important for understanding and can help us comprehend the different variations in philosophies that emerged in Muslim history. I hope to further the discussion in future videos concerning Hallaj. I hope you enjoy this video, and thank you so much for watching.